We're back. Here we are.
Sorry.
This is how I'm starting.
I went fiddling with the microphone.
This is the beginning.
We can keep that
I'm
in.
I'm going to keep it for sure.
Okay, well, in that case, let me just get this perfectly situated. All right, we're good.
And we're back. It's a
What's
fun
up?
day. Caleb and I are here.
As always.
And we're here with the only guest that we've had on this podcast twice.
Repeat guest. How do you feel about that?
I
hope.
mean, I actually don't feel that great about it. I feel
Yeah,
a
because
little-
yours was never live. It was so bad last time. No, I'm just kidding.
That's-
that was the only one that we had that didn't fully record.
First and only technical challenges.
Dude.
Yeah.
So we recorded that one on a Sunday. The next Monday, I flew out to, I think it was Vegas for NAB or something like that. And I'm like, oh, let me put the podcast together. And I'm on the plane and I bop in the audio and I'm like, your mic's there. Your mic's there. Mine is not.
Yeah.
let's be
And
honest, it would have been a fine
It
episode.
probably would have been fine.
without your mic.
I need to drop a little like mic right here as a back. I probably should do that, honestly, but that's okay.
So call Amplio for all your sound and techniques.
Please, because we screw up the podcast. It's great. But we're glad that you're back.
It's lovely.
And I'm excited to have a convo. It's been a while since you recorded that one, but then I saw you like a month and a half ago.
Yeah. We
Denver.
were together a little bit ago.
Yeah.
I think it was like 6 months ago or so I was out here. with
Yeah.
y'all.
It feels like a lot shorter than that. So time is flying by.
We've come at the best time if you're in Chicago. You gotta say.
Oh, it's
It's
amazing.
lovely.
Beautiful.
Yes.
It's very lovely.
Yes.
Yeah.
It is like perfect fall weather. We have a very short window of time before it all falls off. All the leaves fall and it's very sad and cold around here.
Yep.
But anyways, thanks for being here.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here. It's
appreciate it.
nice to be with y'all. And I'm glad to get to do it again, honestly. Like,
Right.
I had a lovely conversation with you all that like just gets to be our special treat.
That's
It was
right.
our special treat. All I remember about it was me mentioning Bluey at some point and how my wife cried during one of the episodes. And
I remember that.
Yeah.
It's probably good because we spent so much of that episode talking about parenting. It probably was kind of off topic for our podcast, so it's okay.
well, for people who don't know you, give us a quick, kind of snapshot of who you are, what you do, and yeah, I'm going to go from there.
Yeah. So the short story is I was pastoring a church down in Long Beach, California for a while. I was on staff there for 19 years. For a portion of that, when I was 29 years old, I transitioned in to become the lead pastor as a multi-site megachurch. 29, which was dumb on multiple levels, but I thought it was great. I was 29 and you're like, of course I can do this.
Yep.
I even remember the chair of the elder board did a little interview with me in front of the church because the church had to vote on me, right? And asked me about my age to share about that church. And I had a great, really spiritual answer for why my...
Was it let no one look down on you because you're young?
No, I didn't use that one. I talked about, I used Jeremiah actually.
Okay, also good.
Yeah. So I used all of that. I remember actually I was following a long tenured senior pastor who's retiring. And I was like, he first broached it with me and I was probably like 25, 26 when he first broached with me the possibility of doing that. And I was like, I won't even be 30 when that happens. And he goes, well, 30 is a good age to get crucified at.
And did you get crucified?
I did a bit. Yeah.
Yeah, that, what was their, I don't know if we actually talked about this last time. What was their, why you, I guess? Not that you wouldn't be great, but why you?
No. That's a fair and valid question. Okay, so a couple of things. When the pastor started talking about his retirement, I at that point was ready to move on. I had been the youth pastor, and then I was a 20-somethings pastor, and we built a church within a church, kind of 20-somethings deal at the time. And I had kind of felt like my time with that was done. And I'd felt like there was something new and next for me. And I kind of wanted to be somewhere that was thinking about the future of the church in new and different ways. And so we were genuinely looking at selling our house in Southern California. It was at the height of the housing bubble at that time. So we had a bunch of equity in our home. We were going to sell our house. We were going to go volunteer somewhere for a year to just learn and be there and figure out what was next. And the elder board at the church was trying to figure out what are we going to do next. They had somebody they wanted to hire who turned them down.
Okay.
And then there were two people at the church who had positions that they felt like we owe them an interview just based off of what their position is, but we don't want to hire them.
Okay.
But we need to do this because it would be honoring to them. So I was one of those people. I never wanted to be a senior pastor. So I showed up with 5 pages of here's everything I'd change in the church. They showed up like, we're just interviewing him because like we need to. Yeah. And we walked out of that and they were like, I think that like he should be our next pastor. So like what they would have said at the time was that there was vision and direction. They were thinking about the future of the church, and that there was a genuine like love and trust of me in the church. I got a 96% vote when, so
that's pretty
good.
Yeah,
from a few thousand people, like to for 96% of them to say like we want you to be our next pastor.
Wow,
it was super affirming and
kind of an ego boost.
It was definitely an ego boost.
No, we should talk about that.
Yeah. It's not good for a 29-year-old.
How long did the honeymoon high phase last?
Not very long.
Okay. What was the first sign of that veneer cracking?
Yeah, I mean, my first kind of like the first thing that hit me was a little over a year into it. So I took over in 2008. So we have the recession that's hitting at that time, right? And a few months into being the lead pastor, go on a trip to Kenya where we had a significant ministry partner. Come back from that trip. One of the first meetings I had was our finance team had set up a meeting, and walk into that meeting and they said, hey, you just need to know, like I don't remember what it was, 150 grand in the hole, and we're headed in a really bad direction and you got to fix this quick. And, so the long story short was I laid off 9 people in a day.
Oh, geez.
Is what it was. And like, that's not there's all kinds of compounding reasons that really had very little actually to do with the recession. It had to do with the way that we had been managing money for years. But it all kind of came to a head at that time. And that was a hard, as a 30-year-old to do and to process. And even still like, there's still like lingering stuff from the kind of hurt that causes people to like do that to them unexpectedly out of nowhere. Yeah.
Man.
Yeah.
Do you have thoughts on that? Like just more broadly, because, in church world, stuff like that happens sometimes where positions have to be eliminated or people are laid off or whatever, but it's also so much more fraught because of the community and the church dynamic. And like, I don't know, I'm sure a lot of people listening have had the experience of either being around when that's happened or having to be the person to do that. Like, how do you walk that line, or what have you thought about that?
Yeah, I mean, one of my things has been, I thought the way that church leadership should work is that like we should create the separation, right? And like, let us handle this business stuff and then we'll tell you the rest of people what's going on.
Sure.
And I actually think like folks in the church want to be let in on a lot more stuff. They want to know what's going on. They want to like, they don't need to know they don't need to be in the weeds, but they need to know like, hey, we're not in a great place financially right now. Kind of here's generally what's going on. Here's 3 major reasons why we're in that place. And here's a couple of potential implications. The staff should have known before the day of secret layoffs that there was the potential of layoffs, so that there's not just this day where all of a sudden people are getting called into my office and then rumors start spreading around the office.
Immediately. Yep.
Yeah. And then everybody is anxious all day long because they don't know what's going on and how many people and who's next and whatever, right?
Yeah.
I thought I was doing things that protected the church and protected them, but actually it would have been better for people to have been invited into it. It might have still very likely have ended up in the same place. But I think it would have been much more honoring of people's agency and desire to just be a part of a process and trusting them to be able to sit with that knowledge, right? Yeah.
Firing people sucks.
Yeah. Have you had to do that a lot?
Not a lot, but I've had 3. I think probably the worst one was we knew it was coming. The guy totally knew that he was going to get fired. Like when I sent him the text, like, "Hey man, can we meet at HR?" He's like, "Should I bring a box?" It's like I didn't even respond. But what's really funny is like my XP at the time was like, "You need to get in and get out. Like don't play around. Don't make it a long thing." I'm like, "Okay, fine." I wrote my little thing that I was ready to go in with, sat down. It was probably like 4 minutes, 5 minutes, like max. And I got lit up that day after the fact for it being too long, which was really interesting. And there's some truth to it. And I think I wanted to be empathetic. I wanted to show love of like, I actually do care about you as a person. This is just the wrong fit, you know, in this seat and at this church with kind of where you're at and where we're at. But the XP after the fact was like, you talked way too long. You should have like shut up and been like, hey, you're fired. Here's your severance and see you later. And I was like, that's not me though. Like, and it made me so mad because I just didn't think like that's the way I wanted to do it. But I think there's some truth because at the end of the day, they know why they're there. They're ready to hear, you're fired. Here's your envelope, and then walk out the door. And so anyways,
It's always tough.
It is tough. Yeah, it kind of sucks, but
Yeah.
I don't like firing people.
No.
So I'm worried if you did.
Yeah, I mean, there's some people I think that XP might have liked firing people. I don't think he minded it. But, you know, it's just personality things.
Yeah.
But I think it's interesting, though, like what you're talking about. The number one, the hurt of like not knowing of, you know, when it's going to come. And then all of a sudden it's just like, boom, it's here. And the anxiousness is like so real. Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't know if you felt like that in different, well, you actually, 100% you have out of anybody. You know, but just the unknown of that. And I think you're right that people just want to have clarity, even if they don't have the full truth to go, things aren't looking good. People can put those things in the back of their head and go, oh shoot, that probably could mean layoffs. That could mean whatever. Or they could at least, you know, ask the question and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd be curious what you will think about this. One of my shifts in leadership has been away from tell people only what they need to know to only hold back what you can't tell people.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And so has been a shift to like, how do we create more transparency? How do we bring people into more? And trusting that people can handle that. I think like one of my evolutions in leadership has been to trust people to be adults. And I think most people are like, can actually be adults. And we don't treat them that way.
Mm-hmm. And actually, when you don't treat them that way, it encourages that kind of behavior.
Yep.
Whereas when you do trust them, it's almost like you're calling them up to that level of interaction, engagement, and responsibility within the organization. And whether it's staffing or budget or whatever, or even just like, hey, we're going to go in a different direction from a ministry strategy or an organization or try this new thing, like the more that they kind of see the process that you went through to get there, the less it just feels like they're a cog or that they don't have a voice or whatever.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I was with an organization recently that they had brought their whole company together, and one of the things they talked about was we need to do X amount more business by the end of the year. And I was sitting in there and I was like, why? And there was never a call to why. There was never a peeling back of like, hey, here's some of the things that you need to know. Mm-hmm. And talking with several people afterwards, that people were like, it feels like they just want to make more money. Mm-hmm. And maybe that's the case. And if that is the case, like let people know, like, hey, we're trying to like increase our bottom line and we want to be able to do X, Y, and Z if we increase our bottom line. Whatever the thing is, like when you keep that from people and you just say like, here's the outcome that we want, and there's no, I think you actually miss giving people an opportunity to say like, oh, I'm not fully on board with that, but at least I understand. And so I can I can throw in because I understand the reasoning behind it.
Yeah. Because they're going to try to understand whether you tell them or not. They're going to
make up
the rumors.
Yeah, we're going to make up our own narrative.
Yep.
Always. And that can be even worse of a culture killer than any bad news that you're sharing
100%.
Yes.
up front with them. You know?
Yes. And people will assume the best only for so long. And if you keep, if people keep creating their own narrative, you eventually slide into the narrative that paints the worst light because you don't trust if you're not given information.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Did you ever end up like having conversations with any of those 9 people after the fact?
Yeah. Like one of them, I'd say that we have since become pretty decent friends again.
That's awesome.
Which was great. And it was very much initiated on his part, which I think it needed to be.
Yeah.
So probably about half of them ended up like re-engaging in some sort of way, and about half of them wanted nothing to do with me, which is like fine and is their right. And I didn't want to, out of my need to feel some sort of resolution.
Yeah.
Like that's my stuff. That's not their stuff. And if they needed distance and boundaries from me, like I needed to respect that.
Yeah. I think a lot of people
Yeah.
don't always do that. And the selfishness of me wanting to have this off of my chest.
Yep.
And that's like that 5 minutes for me, that was my doing that. And it wasn't necessary,
Yeah.
you know, whether I liked it or not. I understood why the XP said that, because I just go,
That was about you.
That was about me. It was totally about me.
Yeah.
And I didn't like to hear that at the time.
Yeah.
But it's very
really
very
good.
much that, you know? So again, firing people sucks.
Yeah.
That's right. How did we get there? That's
How
Oh,
did we,
you were talking about how your honeymoon period at the church
Yes.
ended
Oh,
as you were so to kind of come back to that. So things start off, they're a little bumpy, but then you're there for like 20 more years almost. So
Well, no, I was there for 11 more years.
11 more years,
So I was
okay.
there, I was there 8 years until that point, and then another 11 years after that. Yeah. So I did that till 2019. 2019, I stepped out, not really knowing what was next. It just was obvious for a lot of reasons, and happy to talk about any of them if you want to, but that it was time to step out. So I did that not really knowing what I was going to do, having a few hunches. And then obviously COVID hits in 2020, which changed some of that. But some of what came about during that time was a few things. I helped launch a network of pastors who felt like they didn't know where they belonged in the church anymore. So the language we were using at the time was, we said that you feel ecclesiologically homeless. So built this network of pastors who were like, I don't know where I fit in the church space anymore. I started doing coaching and consulting, some of it in the church, and then more and more of it now outside of the church, working with leaders, mostly high capacity leaders who want to develop like healthy lives and healthy engagement with their work. And then end up doing a lot of, connecting with pastors and caring for and coaching and pastoring pastors.
That's awesome. Did the people who, or that group of, leaders who, or pastors who didn't know where they belong in the church, like that's super interesting to me. And is that people that are like deconstructing their faith and going, I don't know why I'm here, I've just been doing this for 10 years, or was it other things, or was it a mixture of all of it?
Yeah, I mean, so it's largely pastors, and so some of them had their own kind of deconstruction process. I would say a lot of them were leading communities where it was safe for people to deconstruct.
Okay.
And even like, we can talk about deconstruction if you'd want to, but
I'd be interested to.
But like one of my things in like I think if you have done decent seminary work, you have done some deconstruction already, because you have been exposed to all those sorts of things. That like you have to wrestle through, like, oh, did Moses actually not write the first 5 books of the Bible? Is he not the sole author? You start working through different sort of like, oh yeah, maybe Paul didn't write all the things that Paul wrote. Oh, the Bible constantly does actually contradict itself. People have understood and thought about these things in very different kinds of ways, and on and on. And so you have had to at least be exposed to that. You're going to work through that in different ways at different times. But yeah, what we found happening was that the church culture, where like that kind of thing has always been normative in the faith experience, church culture had shifted in such a way where it was making it seem like it was non-normative. So people were finding themselves in church spaces where that was seen as a non-normative experience. And so you had pastors creating space for things where it could be much more normative to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That makes sense. The safe space thing is very real, because I think people, when you say the word deconstructing your faith, because I've had this conversation with friends, with family members, with all of these things, and very similar feedback that I've heard was also like, for those of you that have gone to seminary, this is a conversation I had with my dad a couple years ago, of just like, those are the things that we did. We talked about, but then it's not just deconstructing it and then just leaving the Lego pieces all around. It's rebuilding that and understanding, hey, this is what I believe, that, who God is and what he says in his word, and what I believe from what I've seen, happen in my own life. But that's especially the younger generation. I don't know if I can say that because I'm pretty young, but that's a very large topic of conversation right now. Very large.
Yeah. I think it's good. Like, I think it should be a topic of conversation. I think that it should be like, you should not think about God the same way when you're 35 as you did when you were 13.
Yeah.
And a lot of times the church is constructed in a way to try to perpetuate the way that you think about God in the same way. And if you think about God differently, there's no room for it. But what we've actually discovered, and we know this through work that behavioral psychologists have done, and we know this through the writings of the ancient mystics, that throughout the church there has always been this process of sort of maturation. And it looks like always hitting a point where one of two things happen. Either the way that faith had worked for you is no longer working anymore, or what you had believed, the way that you had understood faith no longer can be understood in that way for you anymore. One of those two things happens, and you have to figure out what you do with that. And you either exit the faith system, you regress in the faith system back to an earlier, less mature stage of faith, or you sit in that. And that's what St. John of the Crosses, who made the phrase dark night of the soul well known, he wrote on that, but people call it the wall. They call it, gets called a lot of different kinds of things, but you allow yourself to be in that experience in a way that can allow you to, at some point in some sort of way, to move to the other side. But for a lot of different, probably social reasons, that space in the church there isn't that space in the same kind of way that there used to be.
That's interesting.
It makes me think of the parable Jesus tells about the wineskins and like putting new wine in old wineskins, and like this idea that I think it's easy to think of it as like a one-time thing, but I wonder if the wineskin process actually happens over and over and over again, and it's something that you're always wrestling with.
I think that you're right. I think about the story of the double healing in Mark, the one time where Jesus heals and it doesn't work. Right? He heals a guy and he says, well, I can see, is a blind guy, I can see, but like, it's like blurry. People are like trees walking around. Yeah, it's blur. I can see, but I can't see fully. And then he spits in his eyes and then he can see more fully. And it's such a like interesting story, like, and what do you do with that? But one reading of that, like an allegorical kind of reading of that, is to say like, there's a picture of what happens continually in our faith journey is that we see, but not clearly before we can see more clearly. And we might see more clearly in an area, but as soon as we think we see clearly, like the reality is like we're seeing less clearly again, right? And we have to continue to go through these processes of recognizing I'm seeing less clearly. And
it makes me think of like Paul picks up the same kind of metaphor when he talks about like milk and meat. And like, again, it's all these different ways of expressing growth and change and seasons, right? Like what's right in one season and like the way what's healthy and good in one season has to change as other seasons come and as you grow and things change. And like, just kind of understanding and coming at it from the realization that that's natural and not scary.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. So my experience, I don't know if this is your guys' experience as you engage with churches. My experience with churches in the season is that there are systems of anxiousness in the church. And so systems of anxiousness don't have, if you're not grounded as a sort of system, as a church, you don't have room for people to like push against your system to like, because your system is overly anxious in a way that it's got to shut down anything that feels like it's going to violate what you think the system can allow for. You're scared of it like crumbling, of it breaking. So
it makes me think of, we were talking to someone at church this morning, and she was talking about her ninth grader had heard a message around like defending the faith. And she goes to him, well, what am I supposed to be defending my faith from? And he's like, I don't know, they never said. But it's like this idea of just like, I'm supposed to be afraid of something, but I don't know what, but I'm always on the look. And it's not to say like there aren't things that you aren't, aware of and looking out for, like whatever, like that's fine. But it's just so easy for us to throw out language that is so amorphous and just like creating a vibe almost and not specific and helpful. And then that kind of leaves everyone to just sort of like tell their own story, as we were saying earlier. And like, does that really create and foster something that feels secure and safe and life-giving? And
yes. And so, I mean, I don't want to, cut me off if I start treading on the ground that we don't want on the podcast. I think one of the things happening in the church, or that has happened in the church, and I think that there's actually some corrective to this happening, is we moved away from theologians who were leading churches, and we moved into CEOs who were leading churches. And CEOs have a system to protect, and theologians have done the work and are a good pastor theologian is going to be grounded and rooted. And so as a result of that, they might not be as good at developing the kind of systems that can handle a kind of church. But they have
and by systems that can handle a church, you mean like an organizational system that pays the bills.
Yes. Yeah. So you think of like a Eugene Peterson, right? Whose church under his tenure never grew to more than like 300 or so people. But gosh, what a trusted Eugene Peterson with my life, right? Like he had the kind of room for something like that. And when you lose that, and when the highest good becomes a leadership capacity, and not that you shouldn't have somebody who has a leadership capacity, but is that the driving thing, or right? I think you actually like lose something within some of the uniqueness of the church system that's different than other systems that are, other organizations are trying to do other kinds of things.
Yeah. And clearly you believe in good leadership because you coach leaders. Like that's a whole thing that you do. But like I can remember for myself, like a season in ministry where I just kind of like stopped. I'm sure you guys all have like a whole stack of podcasts that you listen to. And I just looked at my podcast list and I was like, these are all leadership podcasts. Like I need to take a season where I actually don't listen to any of this anymore.
Yeah.
And I need to think of like, listen to more, like theological, hermeneutical, like just absorbing that kind of thing to shape my thinking, to then bring that back into leadership. But leadership that's void of that, like you're saying, that foundation, that rootedness, like what is it drawing from? I guess is what I was thinking to myself. Like I need more of that to have these good practices flow from. They're tools. They're not operating, they shouldn't be operating in a void, like divorced from like this fount of, I don't know, like some kind of foundation or like ethical framework, spiritual framework that's giving power to what you're doing. Because you can use leadership tools to accomplish all kinds of stuff, good stuff, bad stuff. Like, what is it coming from, you know?
Yeah. Well, I did my master's work in transformational leadership. And one of the like ethical questions that I think gets brought up in like just a base level 101 kind of like leadership classes, like it's such a, gosh, it just feels so cliche to say this, but was Hitler a good leader? Because he accomplished certain ends, right? Like he was able to rally a group of people to move in a specific direction to accomplish ends that he wanted to accomplish, right? And we would often say like, well, that's what leadership is like being able to move a group of people in a direction towards certain kinds of ends. And so then you have to start asking questions that move beyond, well, if we don't want to say something like that is good leadership, well then what does make good leadership if it's not moving a group of people towards accomplishing certain ends?
Right. That's interesting. That's really interesting.
We can't go for like 2 seconds in your story without going off on a tangent. Like, we're going philosophical theology.
I'm sorry,
I love it.
All my fault.
We can do it all day long.
I think what you're saying though, of like, I remember seasons of every Audible book, every podcast was all these, leadership books and all these things that I'm trying to absorb. And then there also becomes a season where like you feel like the only thing I'm doing with these things that I'm learning is taking micro nuggets out of this book and then I'm just shoving them down my team's throat of like, this is my new thing that we're going to go after. And then I read another book and then I just change it and I go after whatever Patrick Lencioni is saying in his new book or whatever. And those things aren't bad, but it can cause seasons where I'm just like, I don't want to do any of that. And then I like regress so far where I'm like, I don't want to do it because I'm almost in spite of, not wanting to do that for my team. But I don't know.
I think it's too like the way you want to process information can change or be helpful in different seasons, right?
Yeah.
Like I think about a similar pattern where I listened to all kinds of sermons and then I was like, I need to stop listening to sermons. I just need a different format for processing through these things. So like stop listening to sermons and start listening to theologians and pastors discussing together about things. Still dealing with, you could say there's crossover in the content, but it's like a different way of dialoguing about it versus the format of a sermon. which I found very helpful.
Yeah, it's good. That's even like one of the shifts that I made years ago was I would read a book. And then what I started doing was I was like, oh, I need to read the footnotes. And I need to I don't want to learn from this book. I want to learn from the people that author is learning from, right? That was a shift for me several years ago. That feels similar where it's like a sermon is distilled down and it's giving you, it's like, I teach preaching to undergrad students, and I always tell them preaching is not math. You don't show your work. When you show your work, it makes for a boring sermon. But if you haven't done your work, there's a groundedness that's missing in it. And so you need to have done your work, but you don't show your work. But you move to a point where you want to see the work. And if you're not getting that in the sermon,
I think you told me once that preaching is a performance art.
I do. I think it's performative art. Yeah.
We could talk about that for a while.
But that is very interesting.
Okay, so going back, so you transition out of church ministry. This is great. You transition out of church ministry. You're kind of trying to figure out what's next for you, and you kind of land in this coaching, working with leaders space. And
which I desperately didn't want to do.
Why not?
Because the generation above us, I watched pastors who stepped out of ministry all become insurance folk because there was some similar skill set. You had built networks and things like that.
You've been selling insurance for 20 years.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yes. And then I was watching my generation, folks who are leaving church ministry, all become coaches. And I was like, I don't want to be a cliche. I'm not becoming a coach.
Everybody who quits church is a coach now.
Yeah. Yeah. So I really did try to avoid it. And it took me a long time to even say that I was. That I didn't want to ever use that language. But what had happened, it started in the church. People started asking me to coach them. And I started doing it. And I was like, oh, I'm actually kind of good at this. And then I started doing consulting work and started doing it outside of the church. And then I started having some people as I would show up and do some consulting and some workshops that they would ask me if I would coach them. And so I finally at some point was like, I think I need to own this. And what sold me on it was I was like, oh, I actually care about the life and health of leaders. And this is a way to be helpful in that way. And it was actually a lot like pastoring in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Well, that's what I was going to ask. That's interesting that you mentioned that because you spent all this time pastoring, having pastoral conversations around things that people were going through or questions they had or life's circumstances. How do you feel like coaching is very similar, or does it have a distinctiveness that you kind of had to figure out as you moved into that space?
There's some similarities for sure. There's some things that I have learned through coaching, through getting certified and going through trainings and stuff that I wish I would have had in my pastoral work. And there's definitely some distinctive differences. But the kind of coaching that I don't do kind of coaching that's high performance coaching. If you were to come to me and say how do I grow my business 10x? I would point you to somebody else. That's not interesting to me. I actually think all good leadership starts in the self, and that I would tell leaders when they ask me oh, will you coach me? I'm like, I will, but if you want somebody to help you figure out how to do your budget better or what, that's not, those are tactile things that are fine, but they're uninteresting to me. And I actually think that doesn't make you a better leader. What makes you a better leader is who you are and how you show up. And so in helping leaders move towards holistic health within themselves, that feels very pastoral in that. Some of what I was missing as a pastor, you're trained to talk, and especially I show up as I don't know if we do Enneagram on the show, but I show up as a 3. And so 3s want to be seen and known, want to so you can't help but you're always wanting to put yourself out there. And coaching, very much believes that you have the answers in you, and my role is simply to facilitate helping bring those out of you. And so in my pastoral work, I did a lot more talking, and instead of doing more listening and drawing out of people, and coaching has developed a skill set and a discipline of being able to pull back that's very unnatural for me and really only happens best for me when I'm in a coaching situation, because otherwise I'd just revert out of it. Yeah.
That's interesting. I can see that being, I found myself doing that in different coaching seasons of my life when I've been doing that with people, and I end up word vomiting too much sometimes, and it's like a good therapist. They don't typically say a lot.
Yeah.
They ask a handful of questions and interject why. And then you continue on talking for 10 minutes. And
it reminds me of the thing we started talking about at the very beginning when it was like, we were talking about communication around transitions and change and whatnot, and how you kind of create buy-in and like investment in the team that you're communicating with. I'm thinking of people in leadership scenarios and the mindset of leading by asking the questions versus leading by telling the answers. And like, I think from a team dynamic, it has a similar effect where it's like, are you a leader that just is dictating, or a coach that's just dictating, or a pastor that's just dictating? Or are you inviting a process and like them to have to do self-work and not just be handed the answers? Or in if you're in a team situation where a team has to work together to come up with the thing, the step, the change, versus you just giving them the change. So I think it's just like that idea of like asking questions as the method to move ahead is like very broadly applicable.
Yeah, that's good. Well, and you can use questions in a manipulative way to still be directive, right?
Totally.
You have to actually be open to not knowing where it's going to lead.
Yeah. I mean, I've been in many a meeting where I know where I want it to go, and I go in and I try to lead by asking questions, which is great. And it actually ends up going in a different place.
Yeah.
And that's really great. That's good. It's like not just the thing
You're
that
okay
I thought
with
it would
that?
be. Yeah.
What is that experience like for you to like have a moment where you're like, I thought we needed to go here, and I thought I was taking people
Here's
here.
a great side benefit of this approach is you never said what you thought.
Yeah.
So like, it's not like you pitched this idea and everyone was like, that was dumb, we're doing this thing instead. Like you have something in your mind as a leader, of course, like that you think, I think this might be a good direction. And you should. If you don't, like that's probably not good. But you're able to offer that in the conversation as one idea among many, and not as like the directive for the team.
Yeah.
So I think if you're able to, I think maybe to the root of your question is like, if you're able to approach it with the goal being a good outcome and not with the goal being people think that you're a genius, then you're in a good spot.
That's the thing, right? Like I was thinking as you're sharing that, I'd imagine you have to feel really secure within yourself to be able to do that. Because when you show up in a room, especially if you're the leader, you have created an internalized pressure that you should be the one that has the answers.
Yeah.
And to show up in a way that says, I've got some ideas about what to do, but I'm going to open it up to the room, and the room starts moving in a different way than what I thought we should do. Suddenly, I'm not the one who has the answers.
Yeah.
I'm not the one who can best figure it out.
Yep.
And I have to die a bit to that
Exactly
part.
right.
And I have to have this like open hand. And to do that and to continue, like you have to be really secure in yourself.
And I think it's helpful to think about it as like part of like a reframing of what we even think a leader is. Like, is a leader someone that you bring in and say, you're the expert and you have all the answers? Or is a leader someone that we're inviting to facilitate getting the best out of the team and building the team and drawing the right people into the conversation as a, shepherd, coach, guide versus I don't even know what the right metaphor would be, driver, dictator.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's super interesting. As you're doing this with churches and with for-profit organizations, nonprofit, whatever, where are the similarities that you see the CEO, senior pastor, compared to the CEO of multi-million-dollar company, and the questions they're asking, or the things that you're seeing the same or different, or I just don't know.
Yeah. I think one of the things that I'm experiencing that's different, that's been super fascinating and unexpected to me, is that outside of the church, I'm being brought in much more for people that want to experience health in their leadership. And inside the church, people are more asking me the typical leadership sort of things.
Interesting.
How do I run a meeting better? How do I grow my church? They're like, that's their starting point. So I've got the CEO, of a $40 million construction company that's like dealing with insecurity, knows that the way that he shows up in meetings is shutting other people down. And he knows that that's something in himself that he's got to work through. And he's like, I know I need to deal with that. So I've got that guy bringing me in for that. And then I've got the person at the church that's like, hey, we want to 3X our church over the next 2 years. How to and so I get less of the health questions from the church, from the senior pastor, I should say, of the church, and more of the health questions from the CEO outside the church.
I feel like that says a lot.
Yeah, say more about that. What do you think that is? Like, you know what I think? You know what I think of is like, the joke how like the church always follows like sort of the broader marketplace by 5 years, 10 years, or whatever. It's like the marketplace is actually identifying the value of health 5, 10 years before the church is. I don't know. Like,
yeah, that might be true. I don't know if I have a good answer for it. I would just say it's something that I've been observing. And I think if I were to try to name something right now, I think it would probably be a shallow understanding of it. Like, I don't think I've got a good understanding of it.
Yeah.
But yeah, and that's not to say that there aren't good pastors who are pursuing health. And I work with some of them. And I think that there's some great pastors who, like a lot of folks that are pastoring aren't even necessarily saying, I think that there's 3 sort of disciplines that kind of interplay with each other, that there's coaching, there's therapy, and there's spiritual direction. And each play a different kind of role. And I experience pastors that are, sometimes they're grabbing a coach, but a lot more that are finding spiritual direction as like what they need in that season. And pursuing health that way.
Yeah, that is interesting. Are you ever coaching with other, like, is it primarily senior pastors when you're doing it at a church, or is it also just other executive leaders? I just wondered, as you guys were talking, I'm thinking about the typical dynamic in a large multi-site church of senior pastor who's casting vision, maybe culture, but is very much locked away in his office and isn't necessarily in day-to-day. Then you have bad cop XP, who is the money guy.
The guy who likes firing people.
And who likes firing people and who runs the business side more than not, but is also incredibly interacting with staff. Sometimes in a good way, sometimes in a bad way. And I wasn't sure if you had seen any similarities or differences between.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
I'm working with a guy right now who is at a large multi-site church and is probably 3 steps down.
Okay.
And I wouldn't be surprised if he doesn't leave that church in the next 3 months. And he's pursuing kind of health and wholeness. And in his pursuit of that over the last couple of years is seeing the breakdown of that within the system of the church that he's a part of, that says it cares about one thing and that orients itself in a way that doesn't back that up.
Yeah.
And I would say his experiences, and I don't know if this is everybody's experience or not, his experience is that pastor who's supposedly setting culture does not know what the actual culture of the staff is. And that the culture of the staff is very different from what he would publicly say that it is.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
I think that's, I don't know about you guys, but I think that's a lot of churches. Like, I've never been an executive pastor, but I've been on the other side of that where myself and other people in a department or staff or team, like the culture is very different from when the executive team is in the room or whether or not. And again, it goes back down to writing your own stories for things, but that metaphor of they think the culture is this and it is very, very different over here is very, very real. And so, like, what do you tell that guy when he's telling you, hey, I'm trying to get healthy. Here's the things I'm seeing. There's a massive, cavern in between me and where the actual senior leadership is, 3 rungs above me. And what do you do? Because then they end up walking away and being insurance salesmen.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't tell them anything because I'm coaching them, right?
Yeah.
Ooh.
But
That's good.
Nice.
But the conversation is always around helping them figure out a couple of things, helping them figure out if they can be healthy within that system or not, and asking them like what their priority is in this season around that. Because the reality is, you cannot change what the system is.
Yeah.
And so I often have to help people own that first, because people will stay in an unhealthy system because they think I can change it.
Yeah.
And we actually have studies now that have come out. Harvard Business Review wrote an article a couple of years ago showing this, that actually the only person really that can affect that change is going to be the senior leader, sometimes a small executive team. But outside of that, nobody's actually going to affect that. So you have to take the system for what it is as a given.
Yeah.
And you have to figure out whether or not you can exist within that. And there's this guy named Gordon McKenzie. He worked for Hallmark. Wrote a book. It's one of my favorite books. It's probably the book I've given out most to people. It's called Orbiting the Giant Hairball.
Okay.
And he talks about Hallmark as this giant hairball full of bureaucratic systems. And he's an artist. Okay. And what he learns is that in order to get his art out to the world, he has to interact with that giant hairball, because it creates the platform for him to do the thing that's inside of him that's meant to go out into the world, right? So he has to interact with the hairball. And what he was seeing was people would get sucked into the hairball and then they would lose that kind of part of him.
Yeah.
Or people would leave it altogether and then they would kind of like do this thing over in obscurity. And what he tried to figure out is, how do I orbit it? So how do I stay connected to it in a way where I can like use it for the thing that like is why they brought me in and why I was attracted to it, but I don't get sucked into it where I lose this this unique thing that I'm trying to bring to it. So I'm often trying to help people like figure out and discern if they can be that. Like, are you getting sucked into the system, or are you able to be a part of this thing and like within the area where you have influence and where you like, can you keep doing that thing? And if you can't keep doing that thing, and if you can't do it in a way where you can feel good about yourself and all of that, you know, you got to ask some other questions.
Yeah,
but.
that's interesting. There's a book, I think it was written in the 90s by a guy named David Johnson, who used to be a pastor at a church up in Minnesota and the book was called The Subtle Power of Spiritual Abuse.
Okay.
It's really, it's a deep book can be a little bit hard to read. But every time I've read it, I've quit the church that I was on staff. So I've given it to a couple of different people and I say, just be aware that I've read this 3 times and I quit the churches that I was on staff at 3 times because of the last 3 chapters. And a lot of it goes down to, am I going to stay and try to fight and be a change in the system if you think that's actually possible? And basically the book is helping you question and ask questions of, do you think that you could actually make a difference? Will anything that you do by staying there change? Because if it doesn't, then you staying there is helping the system become and continue to be toxic. So it's either, stay and fight or leave and be okay with that. Because if you don't think that any of the things that you could do in the future or doing now will help, it's not going to get better. And you should leave and walk away because you're just going to continue to, help the system. And it ultimately goes down to, I quoted this in I think my meeting that I was quitting at a church at one point, and I got to remember exactly how to say it, but it's essentially, and a bunch of different leaders have said the same thing, but it's when responsibility, when the person with responsibility to do something doesn't have the authority to make a call on something versus the person with all the authority has no responsibility to make it happen. And all that I saw in those different scenarios was that is our senior leadership who has all of the authority and zero responsibility. And then we have this X blank number of staff that has all the responsibility and zero authority to make a change or to do whatever it is. And reading that, I'm just like, what am I supposed to do here? Like, I gotta, get up and leave. But it's a good book. You should check it out.
Yeah, David Johnson. Okay.
Yeah.
I was telling Kaleb this last night, I think, about something else, but like it's come up a lot for me. I have become enthralled with the scene early on in Jerry Maguire when Jerry writes his manifesto.
Okay.
And at the essence of his manifesto is we're growing too fast and we have too many clients and we need to work with less clients and serve them better. And I think there's a lot of organizations and a lot of churches that need to grab a hold of that manifesto. If you have a detached pastor who's has created a culture that's different than what they want, and they need to do that because of the size of the church, that they've got these responsibilities, whatever. Like, I wonder if like maybe you've actually done things in a way where you've lost some of the essence of what it is that you're supposed to be doing. And so you need to operate in a kind of way that brings about the kind of culture that you want to be true. And that might actually mean that you're going to limit growth, at least for a period of time. But when you do grow, it will be healthier, better, more beautiful growth.
Yeah. That's good, man.
Yeah. I was thinking as you were describing the Harvard Business Review study where it's like only this senior leader can affect change. I don't know if you have thoughts on this, but if a senior leader is listening to you and they're thinking, well, I don't want to be that guy. Maybe I don't really have as clear a vision of my culture and how things are going. As like, what is a first step that person can start to do, or a couple things that start to illuminate the reality on the ground that would be helpful?
Yeah, that's great. There's probably, you all probably have some good suggestions too of what you've seen. Like, I think my mind thinks more organically than systems thinking. So there's probably some great systems things that could be done that are not necessarily the way that I think naturally. I think one is like you start engaging with your people more often. And so instead of maybe if every week you have been having a lunch with a high donor in the church, you should be, then 2 times a week, you should be having lunch with people that aren't your direct reports. Like, you should just be engaging them relationally. I also think I think one of the things that's happened in ministry is that we have, pastors have removed their homes in ways in order to create some distance in ways that I think that it was probably a move out of health, but that has created this distance. And one of the things I always tell pastors is I say, if you take a housing allowance, the reason that there's a housing allowance is it's saying that your home is a parish. And so you need to reopen up your home as a parish. So that can look like a lot of different things. We, at my church for a period of time, we did all of our newcomer things at my home. And that did create a barrier for some folks because it was weird to come to somebody's home as opposed to stay at the church. Yeah. And it created a weird thing where there were people in the church who had never been in my home who would come to newcomer things because they're like, we want to see your home. But that was people want to be let into the pastor's life in some sort of way, right? And so to figure out ways to reopen up your home in ways that make sense for you and your family, I think ways that put down the walls and the barriers that you have sort of built up around that. I think inviting feedback around your sermons, so starting to create a little community of folks on staff who every Monday that you get together and you critique your sermon, and you're the first one who critiques it to open it up then for other people to critique it. And you're not just inviting your closest advisors, you're inviting different kinds of voices. You're inviting the 20-year-old intern into that because you need to those sorts of things, I think, where, if you're identifying the places where maybe you've put up some walls and barriers and you're finding really simple organic ways to break those down.
So not a survey.
I mean, I'm curious because I haven't been a part of those. Have you found that helpful where you do best Christian workplace stuff?
I've done that.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I think, again, I'm not, that's great. It gives you a lot of data.
Yeah.
Right. But it's a diagnostic. It's not changing anything.
Okay. Yeah.
You know what I mean? And not that the things that you just described necessarily change anything. They, in a certain sense, are data gathering as well, but they're data gathering as well as creating and facilitating the relationships that eventually will lead to the ability to move things in a helpful way. Yeah. So
the best Christian workplace thing is a really interesting topic because whenever that would come around, I would go, awesome. I can't wait to fill this out. And just,
because you just gave 5s across the board.
Because I just gave 5s across the board out of 10, maybe.
Oh, okay.
But you're right. It is a data point, but it doesn't mean that change will happen. Sometimes it does. I think good leadership will look at that and go, oh my gosh, our perspective of our staff is very different than what our staff perspective is of us. And that's hopefully when, good leaders will recognize and go, oh crap. Yeah. This isn't what we're trying to build here. And we need to change that.
And not knocking surveys at all, but just knowing that that is disconnected and distant tool, right? Which, has its place. But I think if I were to take away sort of like a meta theme from what you're describing, it's like getting into a relationship with people for relationship's sake and not with like,
Yes.
hey, we've had this meeting so that I can ask you these 10
With
questions
intention
and
of
like
that,
check off the boxes. And it's like, that's not what's going to either give you the most real data or give you the most real window into what's happening or create the trust that you'll need to change it in the future.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, ministry at its essence is relational. And we lose that too often, right? Or we make the relational circle really small. Especially the higher you get in leadership, the easier it is to isolate yourself. And I get it because I've been in all the spaces where like there's a lot of people that like it gave me anxiety to be around them, that it felt unsafe for me to be around them. Like I get all of that sort of stuff. But that to me says, okay, gosh, if I'm having anxiety around difficult people, is it the difficult person or like what are the things that are within me that I need to like work on and being more grounded so that I can be in some spaces that are a little bit harder? What do I need in my life set up so that I can engage in those better and I don't have to just create isolated, like a community that's isolated, that is sort of handpicked because they, because they'll work for me in a way that others might not.
Yeah, that's interesting. The housing allowance comment is very good.
Pointed.
Very pointed.
Maybe.
Yeah, because I think people don't think of it like that. They go, this is an extra tax benefit for me financially. And that's the only thing that they think about. And you're right. The reality is like, I think of myself and I think of the most impactful communities that I was ever a part of and friendships and relationships that we built with other families and couples and individuals all happened in one of our homes. It didn't happen in the church building ever. It only happened at my house and in the backyard having a fire and a cigar and whiskey or whatever.
Yeah. And were any of those, can I ask, experiences that you had with people that would have been older, more mature, more experienced, or were they all more with peers?
I would say a lot of them were with peers.
Okay.
But I think early on to my time in some of those churches, it started with older and more experienced and wiser people and being around them and going, oh.
Yeah. And they invited you into that space.
Yeah, man. I mean, like we had posted a clip last week from Aubrey Wentz and the episode with her. And, her talking about like, remember the first time that a leader invited you to sit at the table for the first time and going, me? Like, why me? Why do I have to, be here? I don't feel like I should, or I'm not wise enough, or I'm not, smart enough to sit at this table.
Yeah.
But it feels good. It feels good to feel like whether they take your opinion and use it or not, to be called and invited into those conversations and to learn from the other wiser people that are sitting around the table, it goes a very, very long way.
Yes. I do want to throw up one caution that I haven't experienced, but I have had friends experience where a senior leader builds relationship in ways that they can then use to manipulate those folks. Mm-hmm. And so like, I want to be aware of that in talking about this, which, gosh, that sucks. Like that's, how horrific is it that that pastors are even thinking in that kind of way? Like how far have we moved from like the pastoral calling when that starts being something that gets used? But yeah, I don't want to miss at least naming that.
Well, I think like the inherent nature of a church, when I think of this in a staff context, it's community. Everybody says, what's relationship? Oh, we want to be loving, to one another, and we want to have relationship in our staff, and we're a family, and all of this stuff. And I think it's easy. And I'm sure that there's multiple times in my life that I look back at of like, was I only building relationship with the staff member to only gain their trust for my benefit, not for theirs, but for my benefit, so that I can come to them and say, hey man, I don't like what you're doing. I want you to change this, but I have a relationship with you, so you can take that in a better way. And I could 100% see that, in many ways from leaders. Or the only reason, I think the other side of it is, if the only reason you're ever having a conversation with any of those senior leaders is because they want to have lunch with you once every 6 months to check it off their box that their admin told them that they had to, meet with me. That's not helpful either, because I walk in knowing this is a very superficial conversation.
Yeah, that's
and you're
right.
only here to check a box to go, I met with all of my staff twice this year,
Yeah, that's it reminds me a little bit of a story that we were telling earlier.
14 touches?
Yeah, that there's a friend of mine would tell me this story about this guy that he knows that every morning his daughter's at breakfast and he'd go over and he would like tap her a whole bunch of times.
Okay.
And he's doing this like every morning, going over and like tapping her on the shoulder a whole bunch of times. Finally, his wife is like, "What the heck are you doing?" And he goes, "Well, I heard Dr. James Dobson on the radio said that your kids need 14 touches a day from their parents." And so like every morning he's going over and it's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And it was like, you're
Getting all
doing
14 out in the beginning.
yeah, you're doing the thing, but you've lost the essence of it, right? That like, that's what I hear you saying. Like, there's nothing wrong with the senior leader being like, "Hey, I've got a big staff and it's going to take me a while to get through them all. And so like calendar it out for me and I'm going to be able to connect with Kaleb twice a year." There's a different thing between like, I want that and I want to connect with you and I want to know what's going on in your life. I want to know like things that you're processing. I want to know how you're feeling about how the church is doing, like things you haven't been able to tell me that like you need to tell me. I want all of that versus 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I'm doing this because I had to get 14 in a day and I can say I did the thing.
Yeah.
So good.
Gosh, it is so good. Yeah, I think a lot of leaders are guilty, not even just at the senior leadership level, doing that same thing.
Yeah. And it's a constant self-leadership of like, even you start practices like that are really good and well-motivated, and then, 3 years go by, and how does it kind of drift into that more rote repetition? And like just knowing that that's a natural transition and kind of calling yourself back to sort of the heart of why you're doing what you're doing, whether it's with staff. I mean, you could apply that question to literally anything that you're doing of like, what is the real reason I'm doing this? And has it become a rote sort of like box checking? Or am I still focused on sort of the heart and the core of it?
Yes. So that reminds me, I don't know how long we've been going. Do we have time for me?
We are good.
Share one more thing? Okay. I think one of the most underutilized tools amongst leaders, both in the church and outside of the church, is reflection. And so whether that's like daily reflection practices, weekly, monthly, quarterly, and especially I always encourage folks to have a quarterly overnight where they get away and are doing some like intentional reflection on ways that they're leading, on their life, on things like that. And that's where stuff like that should come up, where it should be like, "Oh, I'm doing this thing. Here's this thing, and I've lost the essence of it. What do I need to do to regain what I wanted out of that? Maybe I need to do it differently in the next season because I've just and maybe I just need to be reminded of why I'm doing it, whatever." But if you don't have those periods of time where you set aside to not push forward, but to look backwards, I think you actually miss moving forwards in ways that are better and more helpful and really oriented towards your own growth, which then grows.
And allowing you to actually get the benefit that you wanted from whatever that practice was. Like you look back and you're like, I'm doing the same action, but I'm not getting the outcome that I was after. Like, why is that? And I think that's sort of where you interrogate your underlying motivations a bit on it.
Yeah. And that's normal, right? That's what we do. You go to the gym and you're lifting 25 pounds and you're doing that thing, and it was hard at first, and then you keep doing it for a while and you've built that muscle, and so now it's not doing the thing that it used to do. And so then like at some point you got to realize like, oh, I got to move it up to 30 and if I want to keep doing the same thing, because you've just gotten into the routine.
Yeah, that's good.
That is good.
You kind of mentioned when we were talking a bit ago about some of the things like, you mentioned a CEO of a construction company and some of the things that person might come to you for. As you're thinking about your interactions with leaders just broadly, inside of church, outside of the church, like what are the patterns or maybe the pitfalls that, if there are sort of commonalities in just this season of, culture and busyness and life, like what are things that you see come up again and again, sort of in a universal level in the leadership coach?
A ton of imposter syndrome.
Okay, interesting.
I've been genuinely shocked at the amount of imposter syndrome amongst CEOs. Folks that are leading large organizations that are seemingly killing it in some ways and who are so unsure of themselves, who go home at night with tons of anxiety, who have to talk themselves into showing up at work the next day, and that nobody in their organization has any idea how unsure of themselves they are. I think I've been shocked at how absolutely common that is. Yeah.
Do you see that same imposter syndrome in pastors?
I see less of it in pastors.
So interesting.
Yeah.
It's really interesting. I won't
say
know.
that I don't see it. In
Yeah,
pastors,
sure. No,
but
yeah, that is interesting. I mean, it goes back to like the whole like workplace and CEOs trying to get healthy versus how do I, lead better.
Yeah.
And I don't know. There's something there. I don't know what that is, and that's interesting. And that's like confidence, maybe cockiness of some ministry staff.
Or you could kind of interpret it in a more positive light of like a call or a surety of like, hey, even when it's hard, I'm supposed to be here.
Yeah.
It's just that is interesting.
Sure.
That like with pastors, there's actually sort of there's another level you can appeal to kind of bolster your resolve of why you're there. Whereas with a CEO, like you don't have another level of necessarily that.
I wouldn't say that's necessarily always true.
Yeah.
I bet of my clients, 3/4 of them would call themselves Christians or people of faith in some sort of way. And would even for many of them see the work that they're doing as a part of like what they are called to do. They don't talk about it as often or as explicitly as a pastor might, but I think that they do see, like they would talk about God has uniquely wired me in this way to be able to do this thing.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. Do you feel like they almost would even living more into that perspective help with that imposter syndrome in their context? Or maybe to rephrase it, what does help with imposter syndrome in their context?
Yeah. I mean, so like my big thing has been a really helpful thing that I've learned to do is to try to help people identify underlying hurts that have often developed early on as oftentimes in our childhood that have become things that are driving us that we don't realize are driving us underneath the surface, right? And when we can identify those things, that there's a need that's there that's being unmet that we are trying to meet in unhealthy ways. And when we can discover together how to meet that need in healthy ways, they start to feel more secure. They start to feel more whole. So they might, depending on what that is, they might be looking for, they might have a need to be like seen and known, and they're like trying to work that out. They might have a need to feel secure or to feel safe or to feel wanted or successful or to feel purposeful or whatever that like underlying need is. And there's just a handful of them that most people have. When we can identify what that is, when we can put names on the unhealthy ways that it's working itself out, and then when we can also name what it looks like when they live in that health, I've found that to actually be like, it's not overly complicated. And it like is one of those things that like, when you can just put a name on that, starts to have really powerful.
I know that you have a couple of, a number of tools that you use to help people identify that. So we don't have to dive deep into all of them now, but
sure.
if someone wanted to kind of unpack that more and kind of explore that, what would they, or what have you seen be beneficial in helping people?
Yeah. So with that, I use something called Primal Question, developed by a friend of mine named Mike Foster. And I got certified in that with him. And so like, Mike's got a book called The 7 Primal Questions that gets into that. Some 7 underlying questions that we are asking in our lives, that one of them is our apex question, the one that's driving us when we're doing. Or I've got a thing on my website and folks go to my website and there's a little quiz there, and then I can follow up with folks to help them like figure out what theirs is. And
that
Very
is
cool.
good. I feel like it's things like that, working on your own to do some of that, and then also bringing in, I mean, everybody should have a therapist and have those conversations. And it's amazing what my therapist, even years ago, brought things out from my great childhood. I had a great childhood with parents that weren't divorced and siblings and very little family drama in the, grand scheme of, other people's lives. And I go, oh, that's interesting. I didn't really realize that 30 years later, I do these things because of little micro things that happened as a kid.
Yes.
That I didn't think were a big deal until looking back 20 years later.
Yes. something I was just reading on the plane ride out here. There's this the things that both of you said just made me think about. There's this experimental psychologist out of Abilene, Texas that I love. His name's Richard Beck. He's like, I think, one of the most significant people that most people haven't read and paid attention to. His newest book just came out. It's called The Shape of Joy. He makes the argument through psychological study as well as through sociological study that one of the things that's creating the epidemic of depression, loneliness, is he talks about a convex versus concave life, and a concave is turned in on itself, and that we've become a culture that's really good at diagnosing, self-diagnosing, like what's the thing that's underlying that's causing all this stuff. And he says when we live in that place, that what is being shown in research is that like that's actually creating self-perpetuation of some of the stuff, and that a culture and a people that move into an outward-facing one, which he would say is like a connection with transcendence and finding meaning in transcendence and moving in that way, does not deny the need to understand and know yourself, but doesn't get trapped there, but instead says that there's a meaning that exists beyond me that I find. Right. And in doing that demonstratively, people experience more happiness and joy in their life. When they're able to move beyond just like living in your own self-diagnosis.
Interesting.
Richard Beck's really good. If people listen to podcasts, just search Richard Beck in your podcast app if you want to hear some really good conversations with him.
I didn't do that.
He's great. Do you have one that you've listened to that you like?
Oh gosh, I couldn't pick one, but I just found it to be. Does he do the stuff on disgust as well?
His stuff on disgust is amazing. Yeah,
there's
a book called Unclean.
Yeah, that's the first context that I heard him in. It was really good.
The thing that like genuinely like changed my life in some ways was a book he wrote called Slavery of Death, and he works through existential psychology specifically around like death anxiety and a Eastern Orthodox understanding of what happens at the cross, and deals with those two things in a way that like was so profound for me in my life.
So good.
That's fascinating.
So good. Some homework for people.
That is homework, man.
Do some more deep work.
Gosh.
It's awesome.
Well, dude, thank you for spending this time with us and having these awesome conversations, because this is it went deep quick, and I like that, and I'm thankful that we had that conversation, because there's lots of things that every podcast we do, I end up like thinking about all of the things that I've done in the last 10 years of ministry. I'm like, man, how would I do these things differently if I went back today? Which is not a bad thing.
Have you done a podcast on here's the things I would do differently?
No, we probably should.
Let me pitch that to you all.
Yeah,
I like that.
Only if you come on and you can be the third guest and talk about all the things you do differently.
You can be the mediator.
We can have that be our theme.
I would do that with you. But I think it'd be interesting because you all have had a lot of experiences, and not only have you all had a lot of experiences, you are both exposed to a lot of churches too. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So like you've done your own stuff, and now you've seen a whole lot of people. It'd be interesting to.
Yeah, we should do that.
It'll be fun. All right, we'll make it happen.
We will make it happen.
So you kind of alluded to it a minute ago when you're talking about the primal questions and the quiz and stuff like that. But if people want to find out more about your work, take that quiz, just dig into resources more, where would they go?
Yeah, MikeGoldsworthy.com. That's
easy.
That's where Mike Goldsworthy lives.
Love it. Mike has his own podcast too, if you want to.
I do.
Hear him talk more.
Space for Faith podcast. And we had Richard Beck on a year or two.
That's awesome.
Maybe longer than that ago, a little while ago.
Awesome.
In his last book before that.
Very good. Creating space for questions.
Yeah.
It's good. Thanks, Mike. Appreciate it.
Thanks, man.
Me.
You guys are great.
Yeah. See you guys next week.